Good morning. Can you hear this thing? My name's Jack Carswell. I'm the vice chairman of the Aucilla Research Institute, and I'm also involved in the Jefferson County Historical Society. And my job here is to welcome everybody. This is the third time in the last 3 days I've welcomed everybody. So you people that have already heard all this. One of the exciting things about this is it's streaming all over the world. We have about 200 or 300 people that are watching this event on their laptop, on their computer, and have the ability to zoom in. So that's, for the Aucilla Research Institute, that's a very, and for Tall Timbers, that's an exciting event. And we think this conference has helped us move forward into the digital age. Some of us are going in that direction reluctantly, but everybody else is taking to it like ducks take to water. We're pleased to be in the Opera House. You can be discouraged about humanity and that sort of thing every now and then, but when you kind of think of a fellow who came along here and built a mercantile business downstairs and thought, well, what the hell, Martha, let's build an opera house on top of it. And we're the beneficiaries of that kind of whimsy and that kind of thing. It makes the world charming in a lot of ways. But anyway, yesterday, this is the second day of the conference. Yesterday was exciting. You didn't have to be a scientist to enjoy the presentations that we had yesterday, and you don't have to be a scientist to look forward to today. It's a real fun thing to be around smart people and to listen to them, and so you're sitting there going, oh yeah, is that right? Is that why that is? It's an exhilarating moment. So I hope that happens to people here, and we look forward to the presentation. I'm going to introduce a lady that got mixed up with us, and now we're about to work her to the bone. And Dr. Mary Galacki, and she's the former state archaeologist, and she's a scholar in her own right, and she has become involved in ARI, and we're the great beneficiaries of that, and we hope that she goes with us and leads us into the future. So good seeing all you guys. And the other thing is the Mastodon is reconstructed out on the patio, which astonishes me when I'm in a meeting and they say, well, we'll put the Mastodon deal together because we have it. I'm thinking the chances of that happening are about 5%. And damned if the thing didn't come around the courthouse on a flatbed truck yesterday and astonished me. And so you can go out and we have a little sign that says, go out and talk to the Mastodon. My grandmother talked to birds and chickens and all of that kind of thing. And so you never know if the Mastodon's listening or not. I suspect that he is and his buddies wherever they are. So take care, enjoy today.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. This is our last session of the conference, session 5, Human Cultures Through Time and the Story of Us. And our first presenter will be virtual. And I'd like to introduce Darren Lowry, who will be presenting on, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm not even close to the mic, coastal erosion and sea level impacts to archaeological resources in the Chesapeake Bay. Darren, are you there?
I'm here.
Good morning, how are you?
Fine. I'm out looking at ice in Michigan, so I'm experiencing the effects of the landscape formerly under the Laurentide ice sheet.
I'm sorry for you. down here in Florida, but that's just the way it is. But we're looking forward to your presentation, so it is up and you can begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm going to put my stopwatch on so that I do not go over. I tend to go through slides pretty quickly. You'll note 3 letters, a series of 3 letters behind me, PhD and then PNG. I'm going to explain what PNG is when I get to the end of this presentation. But basically, I grew up in the Chesapeake Bay on an island, and of course, for those that have experienced yesterday, they really know where the Chesapeake Bay is. But I'm going to focus on an area that was my backyard, and then we're going to zoom in. It's basically the mouth of the Choptank River. Anyhow, today, if you look to the left of the slide, you'll see a shoal there. And this illustrates a process that I want to highlight today is coastal erosion and the vanished archaeological resources. In 1631, where that shoal is today, there was an island that was 1,400 acres. By 1675, it had been reduced down to about 900 acres. By 1848, less than half of that 900 acres persisted, about 438 acres. And you can see for the first time what that landscape looked like. There was upland, tilled fields, and marsh. By 1900, that island had been reduced to 91 acres. By 1938, it was down to about 13 acres. By 1946, the remnant, which is the tidal marsh, the topographic low area, had persisted because tidal marsh is more resistant to erosion. It was about 5 acres. By 1952, it was down to 2 acres. And by 1954, there was nothing left but a tidal flat. So basically, this island lost its battle with the Chesapeake Bay over a very short period of time. 1,400 acres disappeared in a period of less than 400 years. Now, the cautionary note that I want to illustrate here, this island teaches a lot, and I'm just as guilty of this. When you do pure bathymetric models, try to reconstruct landscapes, if you were trying to reconstruct a 1,400 acre island at the mouth of the Choptank River, circa 1631, you'd have to drop sea levels by about 4 meters. And that's the sea level about 1,000 BC or 3,000 years ago. So the point being is you wouldn't be able to reconstruct something 400 years ago using the current bathymetry. And also you're using the current bathymetry, if you lowered sea levels by 2 meters, which is the sea level about 100 AD, you wouldn't even reconstruct the landscape circa 1848. So we know there was an island there in 1848. We got great maps. And this illustrates how pure bathymetric models for shoreline reconstructions give us false perceptions of shoreline margins. And therefore, what I'm trying to show here is that erosion has played a major role in our understanding of the Chesapeake and the landscapes that were available to people. And there were probably a lot more landscapes available to people not that long ago. And all of that sediment from this 1,400 acre island is now at the bottom of the channels. Why does this pertain to archaeology? Before there was any state historic preservation officer or even active attempt to record sites, between 1938 and 1948, over 16,500 artifact bifaces, mainly points and knives, were found on this low tidal marsh. And what do these artifacts really tell us? Well, first of all, they span the gamut from 13,000 all the way up to the time of John Smith. But what do they really tell us? They tell us of a process, and this is a process I've seen my entire life, that, when you had that island, you had a vast upland with lots of archaeological sites. But as the island eroded, the archaeological sites vanished, but the tailings, i.e. the artifacts from these sites, transgressed with the shoreline. So in other words, as the shoreline retreated, the artifacts just continued along with it. Mainly the light fraction, not the heavier artifacts. But as the island reached its last gasp, and it was the topographic low, just nothing more than tidal marsh, all of those artifacts just washed up on the surface of that low tidal marsh. And to illustrate that process, I'll show you a modern analog to this. This is down in Dorchester County, Maryland, just south of the Choptank. You're looking out towards the bay, that's Barren Island. And you can see the oyster shells in the foreground. Those oyster shells are the secondary deposits from an archaeological site. That archaeological site is drowned. This is a late woodland site. You can see it drowned on the left, and you can see it at extreme low tide on the right. And you can see diagnostic projectile points. There's pottery and other things. We've dated it. It's around 856 Cal AD. So there is a drowned landscape there that people had access to, or at least threw their garbage on. But more importantly, you look at the near shore and you can see the drowned midden, you can see the actively eroding swash and berm area, but more importantly, you can see the overwash debris. This midden, even though it's being destroyed by wave energy, is migrating as the shoreline retreats. This is a process I've seen time and time again as a kid in my backyard. To illustrate that, there's an energy component here. If you look between B and C, you'll see the firecrack rock and other heavy artifacts. If you go to D, which is the area where the berm is, you'll find the light fraction, mainly ceramics and flakes and other debris. Why is this important? And I'm going to bring this in because actually I see Tom Cronin's listed on here. There is a process that I've seen at this site that may be important that indirectly relates to archaeology. First of all, offshore from this site, there are living oysters. There's a few of them, and they get incorporated with the modern midden. So as a storm comes along, the wave energy lifts up a live oyster and carries it up on that berm. And as the oyster dies, its oyster shell or its shell container gets intermixed with the old shell, and they look pretty much the same. However, there's about a 12 to 1300 year discrepancy between their age. So modern contaminants get added to these things. This is important because there were two cores in the bay, and Dr. Cronin was involved in these, but there are some kind of indicators. There's two cores at 901 centimeters in this one core. They had two bivalves, and their age difference is about 2,800 years. And in another core, they had two bivalves in the same depth, and their age difference is about 2,000 years. And what I question here is maybe what you're seeing is overwash events, just like you see in the modern situation. And maybe those older shells, like the ones with highlighted with the yellow stars, actually are redeposited midden debris. So that requires a lot of investigation. So what are the clues and indications that prehistoric archaeological sites once existed in the areas now covered by the waters of the Chesapeake Bay? I happened to be privileged to work on a clam dredge when I was in college. And these things are great sieves. They excavate the bottom and they sieve the sediments. And you find artifacts like the one in the lower left here, found by fishermen in the Chesapeake Bay. This is an example of material found by Mr. Gus Jones during the single season in the Choptank River. But let's go back to Sharp's Island. Sharp's Island we know existed. So in 1978, clammers hit that island and they began to excavate the bottom. And they found some of these artifacts. These artifacts have a different story to tell. A and B were clearly on that island. They've been tumbled, abraded, they've been subjected to acid sulfate geochemistry. However, C is not, and C is further offshore. It's pristine, sharp, it is unpatinated, and has never been enrolled. And you go even farther out and you find other artifacts that don't seem to be tumbled and rolled. The point being is, even though Sharp's Island eroded away and it's a scoured landscape, to the leeward protected side, there may be intact resources. To show you the range of resources, these are some of the Paleo-Indian points that have been found by clammers. And I caution you here, the distribution of these things are highly biased by the laws of Maryland. You can only clam in certain areas. So in other words, when you see the big blanks, it doesn't mean that there aren't sites there. It's just that you legally can't go there. Let's go to the Archaic period. You got everything from the early Holocene all the way to the terminal Archaic. But I'm going to focus on the preservation of some of these sites. We're going to go to a site up on the Chester River that produced a lot of stuff. This is Nichols Point. This assemblage to the right here was found by a guy named David Haas in a single month in April of 1990. Gives you an idea of the immensity of stuff there. Let's go a little bit deeper. There are two types of clam rigs, those that can dig and excavate in shallow water and deep water. I happen to be on one that can work in deep water. So in this deep water situation, we found evidence of a cemetery. How do we know that? We have a human skull. But more importantly, you can see a hafted knife and an antler handle. There's projectile points to the right. There are spear thrower weights or banner stones. Matter of fact, they look like stone outboard propellers with no pitch. There's one to the right here that's been modified like an ulu. There's stone gouges, bone gouges, and you can see the tools that were used to sharpen these things. This is the assemblage I was on the boat that we found. We also found bola stones like you find in Florida. In an adjacent boat, an individual who was not familiar with archaeology amassed this stuff. This came up as a single pile, probably as a cache. He also found this banner stone and this gouge here, which is fairly large. The point being is we don't know what other things he didn't pick up, and that's what happens. Things get lost because they're not familiar with them. Go to the shallower deposits, much further in, close to shore, 8 to 10 feet of water, and you find terminal archaic stuff. This stuff is 3,800 to 3,200 years old. So the point being is you have a landscape that's drowned. In the deeper water, you have older stuff, and in the shallow water, you have younger stuff. And if you correlate that with sea level, when those folks were burying their dead 7,000 years ago, they were way in the upland. And then by 3,800, 3,200 years ago, this landscape was drowned. So in the Chesapeake Bay, there's a vast record that can tell us a variety of things. Just to show you preservation, this is Woodland period stuff. There's tons and tons of Woodland period stuff. These are only the projectile points per se, and this lithic artifacts, but you can see a hafted trianguloid end scraper still in its antler haft. And more importantly, that harpoon head is made of wood, not of bone. And there's a whelk-shell masket. So in these anaerobic, still areas, you can get some amazing preservation of archaeological deposits. And this shows the gamut of Woodland period stuff, everything from about 2,500 all the way up to the time of John Smith that clambers and found. The most common artifacts are groundstone axes and pestles and big heavy basaltic things that are been made. Well, let me zoom back. Prehistoric ceramic vessel fragments are found virtually every day. I worked on one for 4 years. Every day we found ceramic vessel fragments. However, clambers, the fishermen, only recognize the complete vessels or those things with decorations like the one to the right or like those shown here. And that map that shows the Woodland period stuff, I didn't even include the ceramics in that tally because there's just so much of it. The most contentious artifact ever found by fishermen was exhumed by Captain Thurston Shaw on the vessel Sinmar, which was owned by Liston Shackelford. When this came to my attention, I just viewed it as like, this is normal. However, from the outside world, a lot of folks thought this was abnormal. This is the captain's log in the upper portion. You'll see the thing number 52, bones and point, and then there's some sort of weird reconstruction of what it may have looked like, but it's about 242 feet of water or thereabouts. 38 to 40 fathoms is what he was recorded. The vessel in the upper right was a small vessel compared to modern ones today. It just essentially scrapes the surface. The Sinmar discovery was not well received by the scholarly community, mainly because they're not familiar with drowned finds, so salvos were fired. The negative feelings clearly illustrate the misunderstandings by academicians with respect to fisheries technologies, reporting, and the frequency of chance discoveries. This article came out, they said it was never recorded as hang. We made up the vessel, basically, and it got into a scholarly article, but it's a sad commentary about the peer review process because it illustrates, you know, these issues could have been rectified with a simple phone call, but I don't think these folks really had that intention. But anyhow, that being said, I told the powers that be, well, I'm going to show them what they do, what a fisherman does with a fish when you catch it. And I think everybody in the crowd probably knows what you do after you catch a fish that you're going to eat. You usually gut them. So anyhow, the point being is, even other scholars, this is Vance Holliday, he wrote the Sinmar finds, never had any context, they're not even ordinary, they barely rise to the level of hearsay. And spending time and money is a waste of efforts. However, in 2013, there's Dennis Stanford, John Madsen, Jack Stallings, and Peggy took this picture. You can see going out there where the landmarks were, there's a Madsen's reconstruction of what the bottom looks like. You can see the offset, the upper right-hand corner of this image shows John O'Shea's reconstruction. He was able to really get more detail. And you can see where that mastodon was. It was in a shallow depression or a ponded area. Now, whether the biface is associated with the mastodon, the only way you can rectify that is go look. However, what is down there on the bottom? I guess we'll never know because the Sinmar data are not extraordinary. They aren't even ordinary. They barely rise above the level of hearsay. In my community of living in the coastal environment, I never doubted the Sinmar find. But if you grew up in Kansas, you probably are unfamiliar with those finds. Can we learn anything from rapidly eroding landscapes containing archaeological sites? You'll see this reconstruction. You have Sharp's Island there in this one map on the left. However, we're going to focus on James's Island. James's Island's a big landscape, and I've watched it melt away into the Chesapeake Bay. There were sites there. But we're going to show you what the rate of erosion is. On the left-hand side, you can see about 7 years. There's the northern end of James Island all the way down to the nothing left but the tidal marsh. always in every situation, last to go is the topographically low landscape, the tidal mark. You can see on the right here, a period of 4 months, going, gone. If you adopt a carpe diem methodology, seize the day, when you see something in the bank, react accordingly, you can find stuff and you can salvage something. Who has legal jurisdictional mandates with respect to eroding resources along our archaeological resources along eroding shorelines? It's different from state to state. In Virginia, Virginia is a mean low tide state. And that's what you're seeing in the lower left-hand corner. Maryland's a mean high tide state. Maryland has another law that says we regulate any disturbance within 300 feet of the mean high tide. Well, last I checked, this is probably the biggest disturbing entity in the Chesapeake Bay along its 11,000 linear miles of coastline. And the loss of archaeological sites along the road exposed margins of the Chesapeake Bay is, and will continue to be immense. The recently retired Maryland State archaeologist and retired SHPO once told me, you cannot learn a thing from eroding archaeological sites. If a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? From their perspective, you're not even around to hear it, so it's not going to make a sound. However, I am willing to listen to some of the falling trees, and as such, I will prove their assertions wrong. We're going to go back up to my home turf on a little island called Parsons Island, and you can see it in 1969, and you can see the same view, same perspective, same location in 2016. So you get an idea of the magnitude of loss. If you look at it in Google Earth, you can kind of reconstruct it here. And in 1992, you get an idea of the landscape. By 2019, it's clearly heavily eroded. And you'll note that the erosion is asymmetric. It's not uncommon. The northwest side of the island is very protected. As a result, it's not retreating the most. The southwest side is the most exposed, so it's retreating the greatest. We started investigating this eroding island in 2013. Why? We were interested in the late Pleistocene upland stratigraphy. We had left a site in the same watershed and had questions. So we began looking at this landscape with a better understanding, and hopefully we can develop a higher resolution understanding of what this landscape was during the LGM and post-LGM, and in some cases pre-LGM. However, within a month, we started finding a few artifacts in this buried paleosaw. We had charcoal that we could date, so we did that. And these are some of the artifacts. You can see these bipointed bifaces here. Some are big, some are small. Some show aeolian polish as a byproduct of being subjected to a surface for some unknown period of time, being pelted by silt and sand. Some of these bifaces were intentionally smashed, and the fragments were used like burins or gravers. You can see lancelet points to the left, and you can see that some of these bipointed bifaces were probably converted to lancelet points as a byproduct of them being broken. You also have blades, as many show utilization. You have cores, polyhedral blade cores. Again, look at the top of that platform area of that core. That's intense aeolian polish. Note the bottom of it does not show that. Here's another core. Top of it shows aeolian polish. Bottom of it doesn't. Presumably this artifact or these artifacts were exposed to the surface. The bottom portion was not. They were pelted by silt and sand over a period of time of unknown duration. There are other cores. This is a big biface that they probably were going to break, but you can see the reduction here of detaching blades. This sort of blade reduction from a snapped biface or a big biface or what they call a gigantolith is reminiscent of some from Kostenki. These are some shouldered blades that we found there on the left. We have snap blades that they're making tools out of and utilizing. The predominant artifact from this site is debitage, but very small debitage, little teeny tiny things. And with a few bigger pieces. They're not making things there. They're just retooling and resharpening. In February 23rd of 2017, we sieved the bottom in front of the site, and we found 63 little teeny tiny flakes that I could probably hold in one hand. So that the bulk of the artifacts were found in that single day. Let me go back. And a month later, the Smithsonian went out there. That's Peggy Jodrey on the left, but the right-hand side of the pit, and Bruce Bradley on the other side, and excavated inland. I plotted these units. You can see that on the right, and that it's important because just because you excavate there and you leave doesn't mean the shoreline stops eroding, and I'll show you that in a minute. This is the only in situ artifact that they found, was a little teeny tiny quartz flake, very common there. And they found some charcoal, and I'll show you what the date on that one is in a minute. Over a 7-year period, we plotted everything, flakes, artifacts, whatever else. But you can see the 2017 shoreline, where those arrows point out into the sand and where the Smithsonian units were. And then you can see the 2019 shoreline. It's retreated several meters. The point being is the shoreline continues to erode. What we learned there over a 7-year period is really storm activity is not your greatest foe. It's ice. Ice in the bay during the winter months causes the banks to be undercut by slabs of flowing ice or slamming in. They're like battering rams. And more importantly, the bank will freeze and then it falls, and it looks like something you'd see in Siberia, like solifluction. However, we did some paleo-environmental reconstructions, which I won't highlight much of those in this presentation, but we looked at plant macros, that is carbon, to identify the trees. We looked at phytoliths, and we looked at pollen to reconstruct what this landscape was like. And there are buried landscapes that extend back about 40,000 years to the south of where the site locality is. This is probably what Parsons Isle looked like when it was occupied by humans, maybe with a little bit more grass. It was an aeolian landscape that had been stabilized, and there were some interdunal ponds. However, after the folks abandoned that landscape, the dunes reactivated, or the landscape got pelted by loess too as well. So that's when a lot of those artifacts got polished. So when was the site occupied by humans? We've done lots and lots of geoarchaeology out there and geochronological data. These are the dates, and we have about 15 more dates that I included here recently, but more importantly, they're consistent. The archaeological level, which is about 2 meters beneath the ground surface, ranges between 20,700 and 23,000. Now remember, this is environmental charcoal, not cultural charcoal. However, you look at the overlying OSL dates, they kind of are consistent. More importantly, we just got this date in the fall for our younger Dryas loess on spec. We have a date that calibrates to 12,781 plus or minus 28 years BP. That's at 2 sigma. So that's really brackets our YD loess and the onset. More importantly, when you look at these 2 surfaces that are stacked, we have the archaeological surface, the 4AB1, and then we have the other surface beneath it, the 4AB2. And you can see we actually identified the charcoal. In 2020, we did testing there during the COVID shutdown. We excavated 4 units. We found some artifacts in situ. You can see that on the right. As is the case, you leave, you go, and this popped out. Never seen anything like this before. A flat slab of rock mounted on 2 or 3 other pebbles or rocks. One of those rocks shows abrasion. You can see that. This past summer, Mike Waters, Texas A&M, came out because I realized that there are very little interest in the Middle Atlantic institutions in prehistory. They came out, did some work, preliminary work. They had to cut it off early, but they found a few artifacts, and they got a lot of samples to run dates. And as is the case, they left, and another artifact, this is a hammerstone sticking in the bank profile. So what other data seem to support the possibility of humans south of the North American ice sheets between 23 and 20,000 years ago? By the way, there's a link at the bottom. If you want a copy of the final monograph, feel free to click on it. So what other data do we have? Not surprisingly, or actually surprisingly, after I finished that monograph, within a few months, this article came out, and it talks about human footprints at White Sands, New Mexico, dated between 23 and 21,000 years ago. And note that Vance Holliday, the guy who said there's no reason to investigate Sinmar, is one of the co-authors. Another article that recently came out focused on the patrilineal side of the genetic record for the Native Americans. And these 2 groups are ones you want to focus on. And basically, those 2 groups you can see recognized as being present in the Americas between 22 and 24,000 years ago. Isn't that interesting? So what other data do we have that the pathway between Siberia and North America, the lower 48, was not necessarily impassable? Folks working at Natural Trap Cave found the Beringian wolf. It first appears in their deposits around 25,800 years ago. A lot of people think the Laurentide and the Corollaran reached their maximum at the same time. Not so. The Laurentide reached its maximum about 5,000 years before the Corollaran. Corollaran didn't reach its maximum until about 16. But the point being is they found this animal and they say the only way it could have gotten there is if it went through that corridor, and more importantly, the corridor was passable at certain intervals. So therefore, if a four-legged predator can make it, I'm pretty sure a two-legged predator could make it as well. Other data, and this is sort of serendipitous. Why would you go to the Chesapeake? At Multau, which is 24,000-year-old human burial, they find ivory carvings of waterfowl. They don't find mammoths or woolly rhinoceros. They find waterfowl. Things that look like tundra swan. More importantly, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service put tracking devices on tundra swan, and you can see that those north of the Brooks Range end up going to the Chesapeake, and those in the Bering Sea and the Aleutians go to California, and you can see white sands on one side, and you can see the Chesapeake sites on the other. Summary: shoreline erosion and late Pleistocene Holocene sea level rise played major roles in understanding the Chesapeake Bay region. Coast erosion is dominant natural variable during periods of relatively stable and slow sea level rise. An archaeological site inundation or preservation is more likely to occur in protected areas or during periods of rapid sea level rise. And there are various jurisdictional responsibilities these states have. Some should embrace the Carpe Diem methodology. And drowning, attacked, and displaced prehistoric archaeological remains are common throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. They're not rare, they're everywhere. Finally, after 28 years, I've concluded that virtually all of the academics and agency heads in Middle-Atlantic do not really care to listen about the archaeological record. Many of these folks do have PhDs, but they lack the most important P in the archaeological investigation equation, and that P stands for passion. Also, human interests greatly affect the observation and perceptions of the region's past. There are no academic or state agency interest in reinvestigating Middle Atlantic prehistory. It's contact period and later. And finally, and most importantly, there have been many folks who have aided and assisted with the previous outline research. I could give a 20-minute presentation just showing their names. So that's all I have to say about that. Any questions?
Darren, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
I want those slides of those paleosols for my class.
Oh, okay, sure, I can send you. Actually, there's a hyperlink. You can download it and you can cut and paste till the cows come home.
I have a question. Where did you get that bee? I'm not used to seeing bees in coastal paleosols.
Yeah, the B horizons. I mean, basically they're welded. The AB, the 4AB, is basically it's a buried indication, but there are cambic, depending, to the south on the Parsons Island, there are cambic horizons. They're, as the shoreline erodes, it's becoming more and more argillic, because you're dealing with, there was probably 20,000 years of stability before you end up with that 20,000 year surface being deposited and forming on top. More importantly, those two stacked A horizons indirectly tell you that there isn't that much bioturbation, at least in the middle Atlantic at that time. And it may be because of its proximity to the Laurentide ice sheet. Laurentide ice sheet is only about 250 kilometers north. Normally you would expect churned landscapes, but we have over 15 more dates now, and you get the same pattern, boom, boom, boom. I've got a whole bunch of OSL dates too that I didn't put in that as well. So anyhow, did that answer a question, or did I effectively avoid?
It just whetted my appetite, so we'll talk further.
Okay, have your people contact my people.
I certainly will. And oh, by the way, down in the South Atlantic, we do care.
Okay, well, here in the Middle Atlantic, if it's 17th century, 18th century, and African diasporas, that's what's right. If we had had a slave quarters washing out at Parsons Island, they'd have been all over it.
I got you.
So I see Tom Cronin say great talk. So any other questions?
Yeah, here's one. I'm Robert Constant, just a local resident here who's very interested in archaeology. And it looks like on that slide you showed for the trajectories from Beringia and the big mass of ice, it looked like that if you just sort of were migrating down the edge of the ice, and just kept going, you ended up in the Chesapeake Bay. Is that right?
That's right. And believe it or not, when you look at the geology between the Laurentide and Fort Laramie, it's exactly the same as what we have as a reconstruction there. So it's a familiar landscape. It's an aeolian landscape with interdudal ponds. You have grassland and meadows. More importantly, and I failed to mention this, when you think about why would you follow tundra swamp, they're kind of like the canary in a coal mine. You know, my father ate tundra swamp when he was young. He was born back in the early 20th century. And he said the best ones to eat were the young ones because they tasted less fishy and they were tender. But the point being is, imagine yourself in Alaska during the LGM and you see all these swans leaving with their new breed and they're heading south towards these big blocks of ice. What's that going to tell you? It's going to tell you there's something warm south of those ice sheets. If you follow a herd of caribou, they might lead you somewhere else. A herd of bison might lead you over a cliff. But I can tell you one thing, those birds are going to tell you something.
Yeah, right. Very interesting.
Any other questions in our present audience? Any additional questions online, Jill? Well, again, thank you, Darren. We appreciate your participation.
Okay, then. Sorry I went over.
Oh. I guess I introduced myself. Are you going to bring it up, or should I bring it up? So I just need to.
Yeah, that's you.
Okay. Why isn't it projected there?
I think he was just so you can introduce yourself and then he'll switch it.
Oh, okay. You're good to go. And it's only the second day, and I'm learning this now. Okay. Well. Our next speaker is myself. I'm Mary Glowacki, and it's okay. And my presentation is entitled Archaeology of the Apalachian Bay, Societies of Florida's Early Riviera. And before I started, I just wanted to give a shout out to ARI and the other organizations such as Tall Timbers for this great conference. And I'm very honored to have been brought into the fold. And I thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit of our Florida history this morning. So the Apalachian Bay has supported early peoples of the Northwest Florida coastline and its adjoining riverways for millennia. This area was an active corridor for the first inhabitants of the peninsula, a rich and thriving habitat for later sedentary communities along the banks of the Wakulla, St. Marks, Wassissa, and Aucilla rivers, and an important trade route for historic Anglo settlers and entrepreneurs well into the 20th century. And this talk highlights just some of the many human events recorded through archaeology that characterize this portion of the Gulf Coast, as well as acknowledging conservation efforts and programs for protecting these fragile resources. Oops. When the word Riviera is mentioned, most people think of the coast of France and luxury vacation spots of the rich and famous, or in the case of us Floridians, the beaches of Panama City, affectionately known as the Redneck Riviera, popular spring break venue. But Riviera is really just a coastal region with a semi-tropical climate and vegetation, even if only seasonal, and we have many here in Florida. And my focus today is the region associated with the Apalachian Bay, a very significant Riviera, or at least an important hub of human coastal activity in the prehistory and history of Florida. So, what are the qualities of the Apalachian Bay that made it conducive to early human habitation? As you see through time, many factors contributed depending on the period, and narrow regional purviews must be set aside to understand these factors. And this has been a constant theme through our conference regarding sea level rise, temperature changes, changes in flora and fauna. This may be a little redundant considering the many topics that have been discussed previously, but evidence for the earliest inhabitants of Florida, and for that matter, North America, is found in the Apalachian Bay region, dating to the late Pleistocene period, roughly 15,000 to 9,000 BP. Though hardly a tropical paradise at the time, the Florida Peninsula was much larger than today, with its Gulf shoreline extending 100 miles further south out of the Apalachian Bay. PaleoIndian sites, now inundated, have been recorded on the Suwannee River to the east and the Aucilla River, the latter flowing into the Apalachian Bay, as well as in the bay along the Relic River channel. Permanent water sources associated with sink springs provided a strong incentive to occupy this region, and this map shows some of the more important recognized sites of this time period. The Aucilla River has one of the densest known concentrations of Paleo-Indian sites in North America. Page Ladson is the oldest securely radiocarbon dated site, as early as calibrated 15,000 BP, with unquestionable artifacts of the first Americans with stratigraphic integrity. Additionally, it contains a pre-Clovis component associated with workstone tools. At Page Ladson, hunter-gatherers, possibly accompanied by dogs, butchered or scavenged a mastodon carcass at the sinkhole's edge next to a pond. These people had successfully adapted to their environment. They knew where to find fresh water, game, plants, raw materials for making tools, and other critical resources for survival. Also on the Aucilla, the Sloth Hole site, dating to approximately the same age, generated mastodon bone with butchering marks, flaked mastodon bone tools, carved ivory shafts, and Clovis points. On a tributary, the Wassissa River, the Alexan bison site yields bones of an extinct bison with a broken point that perforates its skull, dating to calibrated 12,000 BC, and that was discussed yesterday. And along the ancient Aucilla, sites 6 to 9 kilometers offshore and 4 to 6 meters underwater have yielded Paleo-Indian and archaic points and evidence of habitation. The archaic period which follows, so roughly 10,000 to 5,500 BP, shows the adaptation to fluctuating but increasingly warmer environments in modern-day flora and fauna. Sites are found along waterways, stream banks, old meanders or ponds, and higher river terraces. The Apalachian Bay region, as compared to its western counterpart, the Apalachicola Bay, shows a booming population trend, with seasonal and permanent settlements, shelled midden and earthen mounds, and pottery production. Most of the prehistoric canoes found in Florida, and there are several hundred, they date to the Archaic period and indicate a vast network of communities that interacted with one another. And at this time period, we also have evidence for weir fishing in this region. Based on offshore discoveries in the Minnesota area, which is far south of Apalachian Bay on the Midwest Gulf Coast, by the Middle Archaic, large communities flourished. A cemetery dating to approximately 7,000 BP and measuring the size of approximately a football field was recorded less than a half mile from offshore. The burials at the Minnesota Key offshore site resemble those of Windover and Little Salt Spring and a few other sites that date to this time period located in various parts of Florida. But the Minnesota Key offshore site is remarkable in its preservation, as well as its immense area coverage and its sophisticated burial practice of bundling individuals and staking them in a muck pond. And this was a huge, huge muck pond. And I bring this up, we're not in Apalachian Bay. However, there's no reason to think that these same types of burials were not part of archaic life in the Apalachian Bay region, and for that matter, anywhere else in the greater Big Bend. We have never really explored this possibility, and there are substantial areas of wetland that could possibly contain such burials. So where did they bury all of their people?
Hey, Mary, there is, the Aucilla Bar site is a site like that.
Is it really?
It's on federal land, so nobody can do anything. But it's eroding.
You,
Thought I'd mention that.
no, you need to discuss that later. Or you want to come up here and?
No.
Okay. I had no idea. Thank you. You are the font of information, as always. During the beginning of the Woodland period, so we're now talking about 500 BC to the beginning of AD 1, numerous Midden Mound complexes are found located along the lower Wassissa River of the Apalachian Bay drainage. These reflect thriving communities of Deptford culture, exploiting marine, fresh, and brackish water resources. And one example is the Coon Bottom cluster, with sites that range in size from approximately a half acre to an acre. And for this time period, the area is one of the most heavily populated in North Florida and probably the least understood and researched. Jim Dunbar and I have had the opportunity, the pleasure to be able to record this complex while we were at the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research. And this slide shows a panorama of the site of Coon Bottom with its substantial relief and area coverage. And there are a few people in this audience who also participated as volunteers in the project, and we really appreciated that. Middle and late woodland sites, so now we're up to 1,000 AD from this region, are associated with what is known as Swift Creek and Weeden Island cultures, highlighted by mounds with impressive mortuary goods and inspiring individuals, early individuals such as Clarence Moore and later Gordon Willey to write their early but seminal Florida publications on North Florida and Gulf Coast archaeology. And this slide to the right shows the classic Swift Creek stamped impressed pottery style. During this time period, in the Apalachian Bay region, sites show a clear connection to South Georgia and particularly to the mound complex known as Kolomoki, which demonstrates a broad inter-regional role. Major sites such as Letchworth Mounds near Monticello, and you can visit it, it's just down the road. A slide to the left, lower left is shown here, as well as the Block Stearns site in Tallahassee support the regions important within this greater sphere. Sadly, a portion of Block Stearns was mitigated ahead of construction of a local middle school, but archaeologist Calvin Jones, who was very formative for Florida archaeology, did an excellent job of recording the Swift Creek component of it, and he is shown here in the upper right slide, both slides from Florida Memory Project. A connection of coastal centers in the greater Big Bend region, of which Apalachian Bay region is central, include two major Weeden Island sites known as Spring Warrior and further south Garden Patch, and extend down further the coastline to Tampa. And Jim and I were also working under the state, and were able to record both of these sites. But subsequent research has continued, and they're really amazing. It's just astounding how recent research has demonstrated how significant these sites really are. To the left was what we had plotted as the core and the major mounds and middens. However, very recently, a scholar, Neil Wallace, down in the University of Florida, working with someone at BAR, Paulette McFadden, found that just north on the private property is a whole set of other mounds. So this site is a lot bigger than we ever believed. And to the right, you see just one of the test units that we put in at Garden Patch, showing the superb stratigraphy and preservation of that site. So moving quickly forward, the Mississippian period, which follows. So we're talking about anything after 1,000, 1,200 to the contact period, is recognized in Florida by large mound complexes and satellite sites influenced by chiefdom societies of the Mississippi River drainage. Tallahassee has one of the most prominent sites, the complex of Lake Jackson. And based on artifacts such as this copper breastplate and an artistic rendering of it, excuse me, it demonstrates a clear, wide network that extended not only from the Mississippi Valley, but copper coming from the Great Lakes region. This is Fort Walton culture. There are subsidiary sites that we know of in the actual Apalachian Bay area, and ARI is credited with recording some at Wakulla Springs, which shows the network of these connecting satellite sites to a major center such as Lake Jackson. The Apalachian Bay region is named for the Apalachian Indians, prehistorically known as Fort Walton, whose territory was defined by the region between the Ocklawahnee and the Aucilla rivers. As farmers, Appalachia predominantly occupied uplands, though coastal sites were essential to tapping Gulf resources. The capital of Appalachia was Anhika, located in Tallahassee, also where the Bureau of Archaeological Research is located. And it was also the location of Hernando de Soto's winter encampment. The Spanish who reached Anhika in 1539 waited there for supply ships to arrive in the port of St. Mark's, leading out to the Apalachian Bay. This conduit from the coast upriver to the interior clearly held much greater antiquity. And this site was recorded in 1988, also by Calvin Jones. The De Soto site produced artifacts such as Spanish and Portuguese coins, Spanish majolica, trade beads, and chainmail, as well as Fort Walton artifacts that date to the later period to substantiate an Anhika as the site as Anhika, the capital, as well as the location of the Spanish Appalachian encounter. And this route continued 100 years later with the Spanish mission capital of San Luis. And this is a historic map that documents the connection of the mission to the Apalachian Bay and the St. Mark's port, which they utilize regularly. And then, of course, travel occurred east and west, east to St. Augustine over land. After Spain's initial foray into Florida, the Apalachian Bay played an important role in facilitating Spanish occupation of Pensacola. Between 1679 and 1821, the Spanish fort of St. Mark's, located at the confluence of the Waukulla and St. Mark's rivers, was built 3 times and changed political hands until Florida became an American territory. Its role was to protect trade routes to the interior and west of Pensacola and south to Cuba. Ultimately, Spain lost the fort to the United States in 1818 when Andrew Jackson invaded Florida during the First Seminole War. Shortly afterwards, it was abandoned. And you're looking at, to the left, another Florida memory, Florida State Archives of photographs of the excavations that took place many decades ago. To the right, the foundation that you can visit today. And then these 2 historic maps that show where exactly the fort had been located. In 1861, Confederate soldiers occupied San Marcos, which they renamed Fort Ward. The Confederates built earth fortifications to defend Florida from the Union soldiers who blockaded the St. Mark's River throughout the war. And to your right is a 1862 historic rendering of one of those events. And you can see the lighthouse to the right. During the Civil War period, salt, cotton, ammunition, and other critical goods traveled through the Apalachian Bay region. With the Union blockade, the Confederacy could no longer rely on imported goods and so turned to local production. Along Florida's coastline, many salt works were established. And this is a sketch in the upper left corner of the process that takes place, and one of the iron kettles that were very common in the production use. So along the coastline were established these salt works, and they would use the giant kettles. They would fill them with salt water and then heat them. Salt would evaporate. They would then transport the salt. Salt was really important, particularly with curing meat that could be a good field food for soldiers. And if you're interested, if you're in the area, the St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge has remains of a number of these, and you can walk out a causeway and you can see the remains in clear water when the water's low, the barrels and a few examples of these big cast iron kettles. The Union often raided the coastal salt works, and the Confederacy countered this, creating small independent salt works. And you could actually get out of service by agreeing to produce salt, and that started to create a problem for the Confederacy. People rather would prefer to make salt than actually fight. But many of them were destroyed, and one site is located in the Big Bend, which is east of the Apalachian Bay area, but it eluded discovery and remains undisturbed, and Jim Dunbar will be recording this site in the coming year, with funds from National Park Service's Hurricane Michael grant. So hopefully we'll hear more about that soon. Following the war, we have cattle, we have turpentine, or known as naval stores, fishing, timber, all of which became key industries for the region. While historical accounts record these practices, limited data exists to tie these historical events to actual places, though archaeological surveys have helped to ground truth them. So here we have, again from Florida Memory, some historic images of these activities, and a little bit of archaeology demonstrating the activities. In the lower left, we see a cattle vat. We've recorded a number of these cattle vats to dip them to prevent them from contagious diseases. There's one over in Ball Point What's really interesting about them is the government implemented this program, and they're very, very standardized. We even found diagrams of how they're to be built, what size they are to be, and how they were used. And then with regard to turpentining, we find in the woods, and have recorded a number of archaeologists, scatters for these camps. And what we find are hurdy cups. There are a number of different types of catchments for turpentine, metal ones, but the hurdy are the classic terracotta ones that you see in the picture in the middle, in the upper middle. And then we also find trees that are carved to hold the catchment, and they're known as cat faces, and you find them all over, and that also helps us identify areas where turpentining was occurring. And then we have many examples. They're rare and somewhat ephemeral, but stakes that would indicate the use of seine fishing, even though it's still practiced today, but is more of a historic style of fishing. And we also find the remains, often ephemeral as well, but of lumber camps. A number of the camps that we've known about historically were disassembled. The bricks were reused by people locally. There's one really good example in the greater Apalachian Bay area. It's farther west in a property called Box R, and it still has structural remains of a smokehouse where they would smoke, treat the wood, where they cut the wood, and then there's a really big cache of saw blades that they left behind. Recent Hurricane Michael, 2018, exposed a late 1800s shipwreck known as the Dog Island Shipwreck, also in this general region. And it represents countless ships that have passed through the Apalachian Bay over the years and surrendered to Gulf storms. And this is just but one example of the material evidence of the maritime history of the region that has been documented, but much more that has yet to be documented in the Apalachian Bay. And in this particular case, there's a very good, very interesting report that you can find in the master site file, which was mentioned yesterday. And then during World War II, a lot of people who aren't from this area probably don't realize that the Apalachian Bay region served as a training ground for the European and later Pacific theater. Camp Gordon Johnston opened in 1942 to train infantry divisions and their support units in the amphibious operations by U.S. Army Engineer Special Brigades. And archaeological survey of Tate's Hell State Forest, which is west of here, records numerous examples of some of the weaponry and the staging equipment that they left behind, which is really very interesting. And this is another photo that you can find on the Florida Memory Project. So by the mid-20th century, Florida begins its land conservation efforts. The state of Florida, through legislative funding such as the Conservation and Recreation Lands Program, followed by Florida Forever, which was discussed by Shane yesterday, made unprecedented strides to acquire public land over the decades. And by 1988, it obtained the core properties of approximately 14,000 acres. Other major acquisitions occurred in 2000 and 2003 from the St. Joe Timberland Company. And these are now properties that are being managed by Florida Fish and Wildlife, DEP, estate parks, and forests, by forestry. And then we need to acknowledge the federally protected land that also maintains and protects many of these resources. Again, St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge to the west, and then even further, the Apalachicola National Forest. Again, management efforts in conjunction with conservation easements, again, discussed by Shane, help to make these connections with private property owners towards legacy land. And I just want to acknowledge again Tall Timbers and the other nonprofit organizations that continue to facilitate this work in protecting environmental and cultural resources. And I mentioned yesterday very briefly that one of my first jobs at BAR was to do some survey work for two conservation easements, and they were two of the first that they had, Tall Timbers / Red Hills had handled that were dealt with archaeological sites, and it's just so very exciting after all these years to see so many more properties that are now in conservation easements and that address cultural resources. Despite the cultural preservation efforts, and I'm not trying to be a downer here for the end of my presentation, but I feel it's necessary to discuss that the Apalachian Bay region continues to be plagued by unauthorized digging. The resources face a new generation of looter driven by the high monetary value of early archaeological artifacts like the Clovis, Simpson, Swanee points, projectile points, and many are not collectors that we knew of from the earlier years per se, but participate in a larger black market network associated with drugs, so methamphetamines and all that. And I stress this because many of this region's resources, while amazingly protected in submerged anaerobic environments, has been discussed, and in many instances located on statutorily protected lands, are nonetheless fragile and non-renewable. To curb this destruction, we benefit from conferences such as this to encourage cultural heritage conservation, and your attendance here is an indication of your support of this preservation, and we thank you for being here today. Thank you. Any questions? Or Jim, would you like to elaborate more on this site that you...
I was thinking it would be more appropriate for you to tell us a little bit about the Hurricane Michael grants in Taylor County coming up.
Well, and you can jump in, just keep holding the microphone. ARI received two major grants under Hurricane Michael relief funds that came from the National Park Service. This is really huge. Unfortunately, the state will manage the funding, and I guess COVID and some other reasons have dragged out the process, but fortunately for ARI, they finally were able to execute the agreements, and they'll begin work very shortly. One project is back at Wakulla, and I think Willard Boyer, who's here today, he would be the best person to talk to about what work he plans to conduct there. But Jim is going to be, well, he's technically the PI for 3 sites in the Big Bend. So this is going to be east of Apalachian Bay. Jim picked, there was very specific criteria for this funding. It had to be money used to record sites that were eligible for the National Register or already on the National Register that had been negatively impacted by Hurricane Michael. And Jim and I, having spent a lot of time in the Big Bend working on fish and wildlife properties, identified 3 sites that we knew were low-hanging fruit. They were perfect for the project. One is the one that I mentioned earlier, that it is an untouched, we think a pristine salt works, which is pretty amazing. The second is one that Jim identified through the use of LIDAR, and it's the Florida site.
It's a Florida Mound and Midden site.
Right, but that's the name that we called it, you called it the Florida Mound Site?
Yeah.
Okay. It is a mound that, because of its location, if you know the Big Bend area, it's really difficult to navigate. It's tucked away in a very swampy area, but it is also pristine. It's never been looted. It's never been studied, and so that's the second one. There was just a lot of tree fall and erosion due to the storm. And then the third is we're going back to Spring Warrior, which I discussed earlier, because there was a lot of damage there, and we're going to help with Neil Wallace's work in trying to record some of those sites that, in order to create a National Register nomination, and Spring Warrior is not on the register, you have to delimit the site. And so we're hoping to be able to go into the private area and extend the boundary to make that happen. And I'm working with Jim. I'm his co-pilot on that project.
Actually, Jana Grubbs and I are the project managers. Mary's the principal investigator for Spring Warrior. Andy Hemmings is a principal investigator for the Confederate Salt Works. And where am I going? Willett Boyer for the Wakulla sites. So anyway, we got our work cut out for us, but it's nice to be busy.
Yes, very much so. Okay, I'm sure there are a few. Do we have time for? No, we have. I'm sorry. I can talk to those of you who are here later, but thank you. We need to move on. We have one more speaker who is remote, and that will be Irv Garrison. And he'll be presenting, excuse me, allergies, not COVID, the archaeology and geoarchaeology of Galveston Trinity Bay. Irv, are you out there?
I'm here.
Hi.
Hi. If Jillian will let me share screen, I'll...
Yes, please.
My goodness, look at that.
You're live.
Can you see me?
Yes, sir.
Can you see my boat?
Yes.
All right, if everybody's happy, I will proceed.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mary. Well, yes, for those of you in in-person attendance, hello. For those of you who are out there in the cyber world, hello as well. I have one comment before I launch into what is basically a very short presentation. When Jim Dunbar told me that I was the last speaker on the last day, my initial reaction was, what did I do? And for those of you who have never been at academic conferences that much, it always, in the past, it used to be that the specialties or focuses of particular professions like archaeology, it was always the kind of marginal specialties that got stuck on the last day, the morning of the last day, and that would back in the day. Jim will remember too that underwater archaeology was always stuck on the last day of the Society for American Archaeology meetings, as well as archaeological science and geoarchaeology was always stuck on the last day of the Geological Society of America meeting. So anyway, I'm that history sort of rose up when Jim told me I was the last speaker on the last day. So I hope that that's not a prejudice, and I certainly didn't take it as such. So with that in mind, let me preface my presentation with I'm going to take you west to Texas and to western Louisiana in my presentation. I'm going to get you dirty, and I'm going to get your feet wet, and maybe even a little wetter This isn't what we would call a high-level theoretical presentation. This is really boots on the ground kind of stuff. This is work that I did over 30 years ago when I was in Texas and on the staff of Texas A&M University in College Station. So, fresh out of graduate school, I landed in College Station and was immediately exposed to an archaeology that I certainly I did not have a lot of experience with. And I wasn't alone in that because, if I can get this thing to move, there we go. Turn my timer on. Frank Hull, who is certainly a much better known archaeologist to many of you in the audience and out there. Frank Hull, you almost think of Frank in terms of another archaeologist, Heiser. You always talk about, it's almost like they're joined at the hip. You always, in graduate school in archaeology, particularly in prehistoric North American archaeology, you always read about Hull and Heiser. And Frank came to Rice University about the same time I came to Texas A&M. And he began working in this coastal region about the same time. And he expressed a humility as well as me that we really didn't know much about what we were getting into. The archaeology of the coastal zone of particularly East Texas and Western Louisiana was vastly different than anything that we had experienced both in our training and our professional lives. So we had a learning curve to go up, and we did. He did better than I. And I'm pulled a quote out of one of Frank's early reports on some work that he did in Harris County, which is Houston, to those of you who know the area. The problems require that we adopt a broad regional view of local archaeology and a systematic, I would say compilation, but he said compiling of information from many sites. The questions concerning how Indians adapted to the area require that we learn about the land as it was before the modern era, the natural environment and its changes. And I think that's really one of the themes of this conference, is that we're looking at different regions, but we're trying to get a grasp of this pre-paleo environment, if you will, and understanding the landscapes like Darren just discussed. How do we retrodict our understanding of these areas? And my brief, small example that I'm presenting today shows you one way that we simply do that. We do the work. And so I'm going to take you to Houston. I'm going to take you actually up toward Baytown. I see if I can get my handy dandy annotator here. There we go. So here's Baytown, just a large burb of Greater Houston. But this is the area that you want to focus on. You're coming into Galveston Bay, you're going up the ship channel through the bay, then you eventually go up into this river section, which is created up here, and then you go into Buffalo Bayou, which is the Houston Ship Channel. So all of these what seemingly look like bay islands are not islands. They're dredge spoil islands that have been created by the Corps of Engineers during dredging. So, and that's one of the reasons that I was charged with investigating the sites that I'm going to present to you now. So let's see if we can make this thing go. All right, it's going. Kill this thing. Now, I am a geoarchaeologist, so I need to say something about relative sea level. And as we know from Woody Gagliano and Charlie Pearson and a host of their colleagues, the Sabine Trinity Paleo River was flooded just after 6,000 BP, probably around 5,300 BP. I stole this straight out of Andy Hemming's presentation yesterday, and I think that is accurate. And throughout the Archaic period, this coastline changed into what we consider and in what is classified in the rubric of Texas archaeology as the late prehistoric and historic periods of today. I took this out of our colleague Worrell's presentation of 2021, which Jim shared with me, and I want to thank him for that. So this is a panorama that I pieced together from some photographs that I made on this one particular project, and this is called Lost Lake of the Old San Jacinto River. And it's not a tourist destination, as you can see. I want you to focus over here on the right with this power line, and then this coastline over here, which is basically, it is a real island, and we'll see that. So this is a typical upper Galveston Trinity Bay panorama. Just happens to be at Lost Lake on the old San Jacinto. There are hundreds of prehistoric shell middens found along the coastal margins of southeast Texas, and with a few having some historic components. The coastal margin of this region is now, I want to make this very clear, this is a very circumscribed zone. It's about 29 kilometers wide from the present shoreline to where the upper reaches of tidal flow creates brackish water. And this coastal margin had a hunter-gatherer lifeway that emphasized the exploitation of aquatic food resources, but also used terrestrial food resources such as deer and alligator, by the way. The cultural sequence for the coastal margin of Southeast Texas has been discussed in numerous reports, Leland Patterson not being the least of which, and Larry Ayton and others. And this sequence has a known time period from the, I would say not the early Archaic, I would say more like the late Archaic, through the historic Indian period, all the way up into the 19th century. Artifacts assemblages along this coastal margin are shell middens that are different, that have different artifact assemblages from inland southeast Texas. And when I say inland, I'm talking about like 20 miles north of the coast. Things change dramatically once you leave this coastal margin. Coastal margin sites usually have much pottery, not a lot of pottery, and not a lot of lithic materials, whereas the inland sites tend to have, well, a lot more lithic materials and lesser amounts, I wouldn't say modest, lesser amounts of pottery, and there's certainly no shell tools found inland, unless they've been traded in from the coast. So, moving on. The archaeology of Trinity and Galveston Bay and this area is not understudied in the sense that we know a lot about where there are sites. And if you simply go up here to the Lost Lake disposal area, which I'm going to be talking about, look at the number of sites. 41 Harris 10, 41 Harris 11, 41 Harris 12. I mean, when I went into this area to examine the cultural resources here, look what I had to contend with. I had to be aware that this area was surrounded by known archaeological sites. And if you go up Buffalo Bayou into the upper Hunting Bayou disposal area, you run into the same thing. There are numerous documented sites up there. So it's not like you're depauperate in something to find, but seeing it on the ground is a different matter. What I'm talking about today comes out of two reports that were published in the early 80s. One of them here is this is the actual report for this particular disposal area, and the other is a report that a little bit more elaborate project that we did over just east of Sabine Lake. So again, it's in this coastal zone. It is an example of this archaeology that I want to share with you. So let's zoom in on Lost Lake. This is a real island. It has been augmented significantly by dredging activities to keep the ship channel deep enough for ships like this. That's about a 700 or 800 foot container ship going into the Houston ship channel and up into the area, that highly developed area just outside of Houston, just outside of the 610 Beltway. So this is the old river circling around, coming into Buffalo Bayou. For you historic buffs, that's the battleship Texas over there. So again, we've got all these sites located in this area. So let's zoom in. This is Lost Lake. This is the particular project area that I'm speaking about right now. So let's zoom in here. And you can see back on this island, so to speak, that is an artificial levee created by the Corps of Engineers and for dredge disposal. So a lot, as I say, when this island has been augmented, it has been augmented significantly by sediments taking out of the ship channel and up here. And one reason that we were asked to survey this particular area was they were establishing what's called a barge fleeting facility. Basically, it's a barge parking lot for barges that are used on the San Jacinto and in the bay, and so it's an industrial site. So it was threatened by industrial development. Hence, call the archaeologists. Okay, so here we are again, back on this panorama, and we simply did what all CRM firms do today. We did a shoreline walkover survey because I have a expertise in geoprospection. We decided that we would use magnetometer and fathometer to at least locate historical metal objects and things that might be in the survey area, because they charged us to look for historic materials as well as prehistoric. So we did 60-meter offsets, and then if we found anything, and either prehistoric or historic, in the water, we simply either put on our mask, and some places where the water was over 1 meter deep, we'd actually put on a tank and do some underwater survey. I like to say that I'm probably one of the first archaeologists to ever do underwater archaeology in the Houston Ship Channel, and it's not something I would recommend. Jim Dunbar knows that commercial divers are probably in there every week, but it's certainly not a diving destination. And then we did, as all projects do, we did shovel tests of all the shoreline and inundated sites. So now I'm going to report to you our findings, and there they are. The upper left is a shell midden. It's a rangia midden. These are clams. And this is typical for what you see when you excavate one of these sites. What I put a contrast in there. This is probably at low tide. This is at high tide. So you're working in a tidal range, typical Gulf, not much of a tidal range. But the site can go from a low wetland shoal into inundated very quickly. And this particular site that we were showing the test on, 41 HR 11, does turn into a shoal at high tide. So what did we find? These are very thin sites. There's no deep stratigraphy as a rule. we don't see paleo as a rule. It is not something that's really commonly found in this area. In western Harris County, yes. North, as you go inland, yes, you may actually encounter these earlier, like early Archaic, late Paleo sites, but they are not common. They're almost invisible in the coastal zone. So we tend to divide the world up into ceramic and pre-ceramic. And I'll show you how we do that. We based it on the presence or absence of pottery. And pottery first appears in the upper Texas coast around 200 BC, but certainly by AD, we're dealing with a variant of what is known in Louisiana as chifuncti. And chifuncti pottery is basically an untempered pottery, first described, well, not just first described, but certainly well described by Larry Ayton. In eastern Texas, the locals developed a very common pottery type called Goose Creek. And there's a variant that we find in our project area called San Jacinto. To me, it's a Goose Creek pottery, and you can see here a couple of reconstructions that you can do based upon what you find. And you have these round bottom, very thick walled kinds of vessels, and they're not uncommon. They're not uncommon. You find a lot of this stuff. So in the little site that I illustrate here, 41 HR 11, which again is basically a shoal, we found 13 pieces of San Jacinto plain and 3 pieces of Goose Creek plain, and 1 San Jacinto incised. We found some bone fragments and fragile rock, and the shell midden terminated at 25 centimeters in all of our units. So it's very thin type of site. So we don't have any real dates for the Lost Lake sites, only that we know that the upper horizons are ceramic bearing and very likely are all after AD 100. But if you're looking at the deposits before the ceramic period, you're looking at a late Archaic coastal zone with very sluggish streams that are becoming more brackish and tidal as sea level advances into what had been riverine environments, and now they are becoming either bayhead deltas and then eventually into bays. So, like I've said, the one little example I present here is a shoal at high tide, and today it probably doesn't exist at all. It will be just like Sharp's Island in the Chesapeake. It has been eroded and simply doesn't exist anymore. So, a little summary of this very humble example from the Galveston Trinity Bay. Hull again says it's apparent that the basic lifeways of these Indians did not change much in late prehistory and in history, and it's true. We cannot pretend that sites that we've studied in Lost Lake are comprehensive, nor would Frank Hull say that his work is. But we can say that people like Larry Ayton and Leland Patterson are extremely knowledgeable and have developed a rich and comprehensive history, prehistory, survey of this prehistory. On our limited results, we can say that the sites were occupied on probably a seasonal round and not on an annual basis. The Midden itself doesn't give us any clues as to duration. But an analysis of the faunal materials like deer and shellfish help us pin down when it was probably maximally occupied. Now, Lost Lake in this archaeology of the Trinity and Galveston Bay folds into a larger context, and that includes the Sabine, the Calcasieu, and the Mermentau on to the southwest Cheniere Plain, and I'd like to take you there briefly to summarize this. So This is the Sabine River, this is Sabine Lake, and this area has been extensively reported on by Gagliano and others, so I'm not going to repeat that. I can tell you, though, that the archaeology over in the Galveston Trinity Bay, it mimics a lot of the archaeology in the Sabine Lake, and as you move into the Chenier Plain of southwestern Louisiana. So we're going to look briefly here at sites in this area. So let's do that. It looks a lot like, if you take away the refineries and the subdivisions, this looks a whole lot like what Harris County probably looked like before it was developed. And the archaeological sequence, ceramic sequence, is a lot longer in this area, but the coastal adaptation is almost a mirror image of what we see in Texas. And this site, I'm going to use this as my one example. This is 16 Cameron 47, and it's a shell midden. But unlike Lost Lake, look at the depth of this. It almost approaches a mound in thickness, and you can see the range pole in the background, and you can see it's a quite thick midden that runs all the way into the water. You can see again, though, erosion is real. A lot of this is created by vessel traffic, but again, it is natural as well. So we're losing these sites just as well as we're losing the little sites like along the Buffalo Bayou. The material culture is about the same. The faunal materials are almost the same. I show you something that does differ a little bit from East Texas. The lower Mississippi Valley ceramic assemblage and complexes do not penetrate eastern Texas. It's almost like there's a demilitarized zone north of Houston. Caddoan and Caddoan-like pottery does not penetrate into this coastal zone. You have this local indigenous Goose Creek, San Jacinto plain. But if you move into southwestern Louisiana and the Sabine Lake, you do see later ceramic types moving in. Coles Creek, Plaquemine, certainly. So there is that difference. But the lifeway, the resource extraction is the same. Good dark point recovery. This came out of the sites that I'm indicating here. You've got on the left, you've got a really reworked Gary Point. Then you've got in the middle, you've got one that's in pretty good shape. And then over on the right, you've got another dark point, which is classified as an Ellis in the typologies of this area. Again, you don't have to look hard to find archaeological sites. They're everywhere. But in this complex just here in the Calcasieu River, you can see you have 1, 2, 3, and there are 4, five. I'm almost missed the one on Choptique. These are, again, shell middens. They're densely occupied. You can't dig a hole without coming up with an extensive amount of pottery, and when you leave the pottery zone, you still continue to find a rich assemblage of faunal materials, because the preservation in these sites is really incredible. But this aerial photograph was taken in the late 80s. Do I think those sites are there today? Probably not. So let's sum up. This is only a snapshot. This just shows you in a sort of boots on the ground way what these river and estuarine sites look like in the upper Texas coast and eastward to southwest Louisiana. The examples I've shown are not uncharacteristic, like Darren said when he was talking about the Chesapeake finds. This is what you expect. This is not unusual. So we have these pottery-bearing shell deposits on all the land surfaces. So it's a dead giveaway. Okay, there's a site there. Is the site going to be deeply stratified into the archaic? Maybe, if you're lucky. But again, it is a very circumscribed zone, and the archaeology is very unique. So the cultural model, if you're going to build one, it's a marine resource economy of coastal populations that from the archaic on were ecotonally circumscribed into the historic period. And my great cultural hero, the shipwrecked conquistador Cabeza de Vaca, wrote extensively about his experiences with the historic cultures in this area. And we can almost upstream from de Vaca's account into trying to describe this prehistoric foraging and fishing culture, which simply added pottery to a well-established basket technology. And it was successful. Again, you go back to the old lay of, if it works, why change it? And I think in this particular example, material, this is a very internally consistent and recognizable form of prehistoric adaptation that runs for hundreds of kilometers east and west of the Galveston Trinity. There are thousands of these sites, but I'm afraid due to sea level rise, coastal erosion and development, many are gone today. So I appreciate your attention, and this is the last speaker on the last day signing off.
Irv, don't go anywhere yet. We may have some questions for you. Are there questions from anybody here in the audience? Jim?
Why would you do this?
Yeah. Hey, Irv, it's Jim Dunbar here. The reason we had the archaeology part of it scheduled for yesterday, but Darren Lowry, his job got in his way and he couldn't make it, except for the weekend. So we shifted this section to today, and I appreciate that. I need to say something about Irv. He's a recent past chair of the Department of Anthropology at UGA, as well as holds a position at the Department of Geology. And he and I were the divers that found the important part of Rayhole Springs and got it dated. Live oak at 8,200 years, brackish water oyster at 7,400 years. And that site has artifacts. It's 22 miles offshore in Apalachian Bay. And I'm going to shut up now, but very much appreciate you being here today.
Well, I got to hear Darren's talk, and I always enjoy, I've enjoyed listening to everyone else. Of course, my day job kind of got in the way yesterday, so I had to cherry pick the presentations, but I got to see a lot more than I thought I would, so I've enjoyed joining y'all virtually.
Irv, hold on one second. We have another question.
Wondering if anyone's researched, is there any archaeological remains from the hurricane of, was it 1901? Galveston?
1906.
Six, okay.
It's called Isaac Storm,
Right, I
in
read the
honor
book.
of the meteorologist that said you better run, and they didn't. Unfortunately, it's 6,000 people died at least, as far as we know, on Galveston Island. Has there been archaeology? Not as much as there should be.
That's a great book, by the way, if you haven't read it.
Isaac Storm, oh yes, that's a classic, and it lays out the whole history of weather forecasting as it existed then. But again, after that storm, Galveston sort of reinvented itself, both geomorphologically. It raised itself 20 feet, and in clearing out the debris, they erased a lot of what we would consider to be historic evidence of that. But again, there's not been enough done.
Anyone else in the room?
Jelani online? Well, Irv, you know, we may be last, but I think they saved the best for the last, the archaeology.
I'm good with that.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that concludes our conference. Jack, anyone from ARI would like to say some concluding words apart from me? Okay, so Jim's going to wrap things up on the bottom, on the lower level.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody coming today, and all those out there in Zoom land. But I think this is a good kickstart post-COVID, or almost post-COVID. We are going to have 2 more conferences supported. We're going to get help from Tall Timbers Research Station, one in 2023 and another in 2025. In 2023, we're going to focus on the entire state of Florida, and in 2025, we want to focus on just the Big Bend area and get in. As we close in, we want to get into more and more information depth of what we know about this area in a lot of different fields of the sciences. And I'd like to thank those that came here, Dan Worrell from Texas, and everybody that really participated as speakers, and come back in 2023. Thank you.
Oh, Jim, remind everybody, if you didn't see yesterday,
Oh, yeah.
go out to the garden and catch a glimpse of Percy.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, we have Priscilla the mastodon right behind the building out in that plaza area.
She's a he, Jim.
What's that?
She's a he.
Right. And Priscilla was found by Don Serbasic in 1967, I believe. And he was looking to get all the elements of the skeleton. And he didn't know where the damn skull was. So he'd go down in the bottom and he'd put his hand on a big limestone boulder. Where in the hell is that skull? It was the limestone boulder. So you don't have to have, you get a little bit of mastodon, it seems like a whole lot anyway. But we were fortunate to get a cast of Priscilla, who's actually a big bull, had bad arthritis problems in the neck vertebra, so it was an old individual when it died, and it may have been a Clovis kill site. Don didn't know that at the time, but because he found what he found there, he helped us, he prodded us to get the Aucilla Research project started. He and a fellow named Ben Waller, so we're always indebted to him and the estate of Don Serbasic. Well, I think we got about 3 or 4 Priscillas and a 18-foot tall sloth skeleton we haven't put together yet, and a bunch of other fiberglass paraphernalia from the Pleistocene. But check out Priscilla in the back if you hadn't already. Thanks much. Oh, hold it. We got to. Oh, yeah. Right. There's a fella here in town, Richard Cannell, who has a 5013C called GFAST, and if a hurricane hits somewhere and people need help, his whole team goes there to help out the situation in any way they can. And Richard, luckily we don't have any, disasters going on right now, So Richard took the time to put Priscilla together. And you talk about an erector set. If you go down there and look, you'll see that I think the radiuses are not on the mastodon yet, but he's going to put those on there. And hopefully we'll be able to pull that thing around to the school systems and things like that as an educational kind of thing. A little bit of mastodon goes a long ways. Anyway, again, thanks for coming, and hope you come back in 2023 and 2025.